In 1984, the Board of County Commissioners of Skamania County, Washington, did something that no government body in the United States had ever done before. They declared Bigfoot, Sasquatch, an endangered species. Not symbolically, not as a joke resolution buried in a county newsletter. They wrote it into enforceable law, designated over 1,600 square miles of Cascade Wilderness as a protected Sasquatch refuge, and attached criminal penalties to anyone who killed one: a year in county jail, a $1,000 fine, and they explicitly banned the insanity defense at trial, meaning if you killed a Bigfoot in Skamania County and tried to argue in court that you must have been out of your mind, the judge would not hear it. The law assumed the creature was real, assumed you knew what you were doing, and held you accountable. Now, think about that for a second. Every major scientific institution in the country says Bigfoot does not exist. The Smithsonian has never acknowledged it. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has never listed it. No university biology department in America would risk its credibility by formally studying it. Mainstream media treats every sighting as a punchline. The crazy uncle at Thanksgiving who swears he saw something in the woods, and yet a duly elected county government in the state of Washington looked at what was happening inside its borders, looked at the reports stacking up on their desks, looked at what was walking out of those forests and being seen by their own citizens and their own law enforcement, and decided the most rational response was to write this creature into the legal code and protect it. Not study it, not debunk it, protect it. And this wasn't even their first attempt. 15 years earlier, in 1969, the same county had passed an even harsher version of the law, making the killing of Bigfoot a felony. 5 years in prison, $10,000. The board chairman told the press on the record that it was not a joke and that there was reason to believe such an animal existed. The local newspaper had to notarize its own article because readers refused to believe the ordinance was real. That is how far the county went to make people take this seriously. So what was happening in Skamania County that made elected officials put their names on something like this? What were people encountering in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest? Over 1 million acres of old-growth timber, volcanic ridgelines, and river valleys so remote that large sections have never been formally surveyed. What happened at a mining cabin on the shoulder of Mount St. Helens in 1924 that was so violent, so sustained, and so impossible to explain that the location itself was permanently renamed after the creatures that attacked it? What were drivers seeing crossing the highway at 4 in the morning? What were sheriffs photographing in the mud near logging operations? And why, in December of 2024, just a few months ago, did 2 men walk into that same forest to search for Sasquatch and never walk out? I've covered a lot of strange institutional behavior on this channel. Sealed reports, suppressed investigations, agencies that go quiet the moment questions get uncomfortable. But I have never come across a case where the gap between what official science says and what a government body actually did is this wide. Mainstream science says Bigfoot doesn't exist. Skamania County wrote a law that says it does. One of those positions is wrong, and when you see what was happening in those forests, what had been happening for over a century before that law was ever drafted, you start to understand which side had the evidence. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Thanks. To understand why Skamania County went where no other government body in America was willing to go, you first need to understand the place itself. Skamania County sits in the southwestern corner of Washington State, wedged between the Columbia River Gorge to the south and the Cascade Range to the north and east. It is dominated by the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, over 1 million acres of old-growth Douglas fir, western red cedar, and hemlock draped over volcanic ridgelines that climb past 5,000 feet. Mount St. Helens sits at the county's northern edge. Mount Adams looms to the east. Between them runs a corridor of river valleys, lava tubes, and heavily timbered drainages that have never been fully mapped by any agency. The population density is under 8 people per square mile across most of the county, more elk than humans in most census tracts. The main highway, State Route 14, hugs the Columbia River along the southern border, and once you leave it heading north, civilization thins out fast. Cell service dies within miles. The terrain is steep, soaked by over 80 inches of rain per year in some areas, and cut by streams that flood without warning. This is not a place where people casually wander. Search and rescue operations here routinely take days, not hours, and the volunteers who run them will tell you the forest does not forgive poor preparation. The most recent proof of that came in December of 2024. 2 men from Portland, ages 59 and 37, went into the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, specifically to search for Sasquatch. They were expected home on Christmas Eve. They never came back. A family member reported them missing at 1 in the morning on Christmas Day. Over 60 search and rescue volunteers from multiple agencies, including the U.S. Coast Guard running infrared from the air, spent 3 days in freezing rain, snow, and high water levels combing the forest. They found both men dead in a heavily wooded area. Cause of death was exposure, based on weather conditions, and what authorities described as ill preparedness. That happened just a few months ago, in the same county that has a law protecting Bigfoot. The forest that the government designated as a refuge for a creature they say is endangered is the same forest that just killed 2 men who went looking for it. That's the kind of place we're talking about, and the things that have been seen in it go back far longer than any county ordinance. Before the miners, before the settlers, before the word Bigfoot was ever printed in a newspaper, the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest knew exactly what lived in those forests. The word Sasquatch itself comes from the Halkomelem term Saskets, used by the Coast Salish peoples of British Columbia and Washington. It translates roughly to wild man. This wasn't a borrowed term or a marketing invention. It was a name that predated European contact by centuries, and it described a being that the people who lived on this land treated not as myth, but as fact. Among the Coast Salish, Sasquatch was understood as a powerful, generally benign supernatural being in the shape of a very large, hairy, wild man. Not a monster to be hunted, not a demon to be feared, a guardian of the forest. Something that existed in the deep places and maintained the balance of the natural world. The St. Siles people of British Columbia went further. They regarded Sasquatch as another tribe entirely, one that spoke its own language, and lived alongside human communities in the remote mountains. They didn't treat the Bigfoot as an animal. They treated it as a people. The Lummi of the Pacific Northwest spoke of Tsemekwes, nocturnal, hairy giants that dwelled in the mountains and forests. The Kano treated Sasquatch as an unidentified indigenous people called the Sea-A-Teek, beings who reportedly could communicate in multiple languages and used plant medicine to make themselves nearly invisible. The Kano didn't just tell stories about these beings. They left food offerings for them. That is not how you treat a campfire tale. That is how you treat a neighbor you respect and do not want to anger. The Klickitat people, whose territory encompassed parts of southern Washington, wove Bigfoot-like figures directly into their traditional baskets, the ones used for gathering huckleberries. This is not just oral tradition. This is physical artifact evidence. Material culture depicting these beings as part of the lived landscape, preserved in museum collections. The Cowlitz people, whose territory included Mount St. Helens itself, called the mountain Lawet Lat La. Their oral traditions included specific warnings about the mountain's interior and the beings that inhabited the surrounding forests. And then there's the documented encounter from 1847, when a French-Canadian artist named Paul Kane attempted to travel to the headwaters of the Lewis River to paint Mount St. Helens. Multnomah people refused to guide him into the area, telling him that a race of giant, hairy cannibals lived near those headwaters. This was recorded in period accounts decades before anyone used the word Bigfoot, decades before the Ape Canyon incident, decades before the Patterson-Gimlin film or the media frenzy of the 1960s. The indigenous peoples of this region were not confused about what was in their forests. I personally think this is the part most people in the mainstream miss entirely. Over 50 documented indigenous names exist for Bigfoot-type creatures across North American tribes. 50. The Lakota Sioux speak of Chiatanka. The Algonquin have the Wendigo. The Yaquit of California call it Mayak-Tatat. The Hupa say Oma. The Chickasaw say Lofa. These aren't variations on the same campfire story passed along trade routes. These are independent traditions from people separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, describing the same type of being: large, bipedal, hairy, intelligent, connected to the deep wilderness. When I say the indigenous oral record is data, not decoration, this is what I mean. And when a county government in Washington finally wrote Bigfoot into law in 1969, they were not inventing a new idea. They were catching up to knowledge that had existed on this continent for millennia. But the event that truly put Skamania County on the map, the incident that gave the region its permanent association with Bigfoot and set the stage for everything that followed, Kamrakwam, happened on a July night in 1924 on the southeast shoulder of Mount St. Helens. 5 gold prospectors had been working the Vander White claim for 6 years in the area around Pumice Butte, about 2 miles east of the mountain's peak. They had built a small cabin in the shadow of a deep canyon and had been pulling promising assays from their claim. They knew the terrain, the wildlife, the weather. These were not weekend hikers, spooked by shadows. These were men who had lived and worked in that wilderness for half a decade. For weeks before the attack, the miners had been finding oversized footprints near creek beds and springs. The largest measured 19 inches long, pressed 4 inches deep into soft earth. Ground that would barely hold the impression of a man's boot. At night they heard thumping sounds from the surrounding forest, rhythmic, deliberate, like a large man beating his chest with a closed fist. And then the whistling. From multiple points in the darkness, high-pitched whistles would call back and forth, as if 2 sources were communicating with each other across distance. The sounds put the miners on edge. They began carrying their rifles on every trip outside the cabin, even short walks to the spring for water. The first visual encounter came during one of those water runs. 2 of the miners approached the spring and spotted a roughly 7-foot-tall creature standing on the opposite side, partially concealed behind a pine tree. It was covered in blackish-brown hair and had an ape-like face, but it stood upright like a man. It peered around the trunk of the tree, watching them. One of the miners shouted and raised his rifle. He fired, and bark flew off the tree where the round struck. The Bigfoot dodged behind the trunk. Moments later, it reappeared about 200 yards down a small side canyon, running upright, fast and fluid over rough terrain. 3 more shots were fired before it disappeared from view. Later that same day, another one of the miners spotted a second Bigfoot standing near the edge of the main canyon. About 80 yards away, in the open, he fired 3 times. At least 1 round connected. The creature stumbled backward and toppled over the cliff edge, falling roughly 400 feet into the gorge below. The miners discussed leaving immediately. One of them argued it was better to lose their equipment than their lives. They all agreed. but it was already too late in the day to reach their vehicle before dark. They decided to hold up in the cabin until morning. That decision cost them the worst night of their lives. What happened after dark is what turned a remote mining claim into one of the most famous Bigfoot encounters in history. The cabin came under sustained attack. Large rocks were hurled against the walls from multiple directions simultaneously. The impacts shook the structure hard enough to rattle the tools inside. Stones struck the roof and rolled off. The miners described the bombardment as coming from all sides at once, as if multiple Bigfoot were coordinating the assault in response to the shooting earlier that day. At one point, a creature reportedly reached through a gap in the cabin's construction and grabbed hold of an axe, trying to pull it out through the opening. The miners drove it back before it could free the blade. They fired through the walls and through gaps in the logs throughout the night, shooting only during active attacks, then holding fire when the bombardment paused. They later said they hoped the creatures would realize the miners were only defending themselves. But every time the shooting stopped, the rocks resumed, minutes later, from a different angle. The attacks came in waves, pausing just long enough for the men to think it was over, then starting again with renewed force. The acoustics of the canyon amplified every impact, every crash of stone against wood. No one slept, no one put down a weapon. The night stretched on hour by hour, and the only thing between those 5 men and whatever was outside was a cabin made of hand-cut logs and a dwindling supply of ammunition. The siege lasted until dawn. When first light broke, the creatures withdrew into the forest. The miners did not wait a single moment longer than necessary. They packed nothing, no equipment, no supplies, no gold samples. They abandoned the Vander White claim entirely, leaving behind everything they had built and earned over 6 years of work, and fled on foot to Spirit Lake. One of them reported the incident to a ranger at the station there. The story leaked to friends, then to the press, and within days it was running in newspapers across Oregon and Washington. The media dubbed it the Great Hairy Ape Hunt of 1924, as curious locals and armed hunters descended on the area by the dozens, searching the canyon for the body of the Bigfoot that had been shot off the cliff. U.S. Forest Service Rangers J. H. Huffman and William Welch conducted the official investigation. They descended into the canyon and found nothing, no body, no blood, no remains. They demonstrated how 14-inch footprints found near the cabin could theoretically be faked, and concluded the miners had most likely placed the stones near the cabin themselves. Another theory proposed later by a YMCA camp director suggested that local youth from Camp Meehan on Spirit Lake had been throwing lightweight pumice stones into the canyon for fun, not realizing miners were camped below. The canyon's acoustics, the theory went, could have distorted the young campers' voices into something that sounded inhuman. But here's the thing that I keep coming back to whenever I research this case. Not one of the 5 miners ever recanted. Not one. They maintained their account for the rest of their lives, even when it cost them credibility and reputation. One of them later wrote a full book detailing every moment of the siege, and went further, speculating that the Bigfoot creatures might have been extra-dimensional beings, rather than purely physical animals. You can disagree with that interpretation, but the fact that he was still writing about it decades later tells you he wasn't a man who had moved on from a prank. He was a man trying to make sense of something that had fundamentally changed his understanding of what was possible. Decades later, a researcher named Mark Meyersel became obsessed with the Ape Canyon story after seeing a dramatization of it on television as an 8-year-old. Working as a land surveyor, Meyersel spent years of his free time tracking down primary sources. Original 1924 newspaper articles, mining claim, documents, historical maps, photographs. He spent his weekends on foot, trudging through the basalt canyons and forested hillsides near Spirit Lake, searching for the cabin site, and he found it. The actual location, lost to history for decades, confirmed by the documentary evidence he had assembled. His research was published as a zine, Mountain Devil, the 1924 Ape Canyon attack and its aftermath, and won the Washington State Library Zine Contest in 2019. It is one of the most thoroughly sourced investigations of a Bigfoot encounter ever conducted. The physical location was permanently renamed. The canyon became Ape Canyon. The nearby lava tube became Ape Cave. The names stuck because the story stuck, because the people who lived it never backed down. 5 working men walked away from a productive gold claim, left money in the ground, because what attacked them was something they could not explain. They held to that story until they died. That is the kind of evidence that does not get taken seriously by mainstream science, but it is exactly the kind of evidence that county commissioners living 45 miles away would have taken very seriously when the reports kept coming in over the following decades. And then in 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted. The blast obliterated 230 square miles of forest, killed 57 people, and buried Spirit Lake, Ape Canyon, and much of the surrounding terrain under hundreds of feet of volcanic debris and ash. The physical landscape where the 1924 encounter occurred was fundamentally erased from the earth, but by then, the legacy was permanent. Ape Canyon had already spent 56 years as shorthand for something unexplained in the forests of southwestern Washington, and the sightings that followed would only build. The decades after Ape Canyon established a pattern that accelerated steadily through the mid-20th century and showed no signs of stopping. In 1950, a 7-year-old girl near the edge of a forest in the area reported being watched by a large creature with what she described as kind eyes while playing with friends. She was not screaming or hysterical. She simply told adults what she had seen. Investigation of the encounter found rabbit pens opened with a level of dexterity not attributed to any known local wildlife, and guard dogs that had been begging to be let inside their owners' homes with their tails between their legs. Animals that had been trained to stand their ground against bears and cougars reduced to whimpering at the door. In 1955, YMCA counselors at Camp Meehan on Spirit Lake, the same Spirit Lake adjacent to Ape Canyon, the same Spirit Lake that would be destroyed 25 years later by the eruption, claimed to have spotted an albino Sasquatch throwing logs in the forest. An albino, a creature variant that would require a breeding population large enough to produce genetic anomalies. That detail gets overlooked constantly, but it carries implications that most people don't think through. If there's an albino, there's a population. If there's a population, there's a range. And the range the reports kept pointing to was the same corridor of old-growth forest stretching between Mount St. Helens and the Gifford Pinchot. Then, 1958 changed everything nationally. A construction worker named Jerry Crew discovered massive footprints at a logging site near Bluff Creek in Northern California. The Humboldt Times ran the story and coined the term Bigfoot. The Pacific Northwest became the global epicenter of Sasquatch interest overnight. 9 years later, in 1967, the Patterson-Gimlin film was shot at that same Bluff Creek location. Roughly 1 minute of shaky 16mm footage showing what appears to be a large bipedal hair-covered creature walking along a creek bed and looking back at the camera. Whether that film is genuine or an elaborate hoax remains the single most debated question in cryptozoology, but its effect was undeniable. It supercharged public interest and drew researchers, hunters, thrill seekers, and armed amateurs into Pacific Northwest forests by the hundreds. Skamania County, absorbed the full force of that wave, and the reports that came in were not from fringe believers or attention seekers. They were from ordinary people doing ordinary things who encountered something that did not fit into any category they understood. In February of 1969, a man named Don Cox was driving Highway 14, the main road running through the county along the Columbia River, at 4 in the morning. He saw what he thought was a fallen tree blocking the road. Then it moved. 8 to 10 feet tall, humanoid, covered in hair, with the face of an ape. The Bigfoot crossed the highway and jumped a steep 14-foot ledge with apparent ease, vanishing into the woods on the far side. Police investigated and found a smeared track going up the slope, 8 inches long, pressed over 3 inches deep into the dirt. That was 1 month before the county passed its first Bigfoot protection law. In September of that same year, Skamania County Sheriff Bill Klosner personally photographed 2 Bigfoot tracks near a logging operation 5 miles north of Stevenson, the county seat. The prints measured 15.5 inches long by 9 inches wide. I want to emphasize that point. This was not a civilian report filed and forgotten. This was the county sheriff, the senior law enforcement officer in the jurisdiction, documenting physical evidence with his own camera and adding it to the record. Whatever he saw in that mud was convincing enough for him to photograph it and report it officially. The following summer, 1970, brought 3 separate Bigfoot reports from Beacon Rock State Park alone. A Portland man entered a cave in the park and encountered a creature inside, large, hair-covered, and very much alive. Another visitor measured footprints near a trail that came back at 19 inches long and 9 inches wide. And a woman who was changing a tire on the side of the road in the middle of the night came face to face with a Bigfoot that approached her vehicle. She provided a detailed, specific description to authorities afterward. 3 separate reports from 3 separate people in a single summer, all from the same state park. I spent weeks pulling the timeline together on this, cross-referencing the reports with dates and locations, and what struck me was the density. This wasn't one story from one person in 1 year. This was a pattern, a wave that built for 2 decades across the same geography, involving law enforcement, park visitors, loggers, drivers, and residents who had no connection to each other and no apparent reason to fabricate matching accounts. And underneath all of it ran the deeper current of Indigenous testimony stretching back centuries. The Bigfoot sightings weren't random. They clustered in the same drainages, the same ridgelines, the same old-growth corridors, where the Cowlitz and the Klickitat and the Salish peoples had always said these beings lived. Something was being seen repeatedly by people who didn't know each other, in places the Indigenous record had flagged for generations. And armed hunters were flooding into the forests after every report, looking for something to shoot. That last part is what finally forced the county to act. On April 1st, 1969, the Skamania County Board of Commissioners passed Ordinance 69-01. The ordinance declared that the absence of specific laws covering the taking of specimens encouraged laxity in the use of firearms and posed a clear and present threat to the safety and well-being of persons living or traveling within the boundaries of Skamania County, as well as to the creatures themselves. That last phrase is the one that matters, as well as to the creatures themselves. The county included Bigfoot in the class of entities being protected. That is not a joke. That is a legal document acknowledging that the things being reported might be real and might need protection. The law classified any premeditated, willful, and wanton slaying of any creature commonly described as Sasquatch, Bigfoot, or ape-like creature as a felony, punishable by a fine not to exceed $10,000 and imprisonment in the county jail for a period not to exceed 5 years. The board chairman, Conrad Lundy Jr., went went on the record with the press and stated plainly that there was reason to believe such an animal existed, and that there was even more reason to make it safe from prior prosecution. The ordinance was passed on April Fool's Day, which haunted its credibility from the start. The Skamania County Pioneer newspaper published the text of the ordinance, and when readers treated it as a gag, the publisher had the article notarized twice and reprinted it with the notarization stamps visible. This was real. This was law. 15 years later, the county didn't walk it back. They doubled down. Ordinance 1984-02, passed on April 16, 1984, repealed the felony classification and replaced it with a more refined legal framework. The killing of Bigfoot with malice aforethought became a gross misdemeanor. 1 year in jail, $1,000. An accidental killing was a simple misdemeanor. 6 months, $500. But the 1984 amendment went further than the original in 3 critical ways. First, it declared Bigfoot an endangered species, using that exact legal language. Second, it designated all of Skamania County as a Sasquatch refuge. And third, it explicitly banned the insanity defense at trial. That third point is the one that I think people gloss over too quickly, and it's the one that tells you the most about what the county commissioners actually believed. If this law were purely a tourism stunt or an inside joke by board officials, why would they bother specifying that you cannot plead insanity if you kill a Bigfoot? That clause only matters if the county anticipated a real scenario in which a real person kills a real creature and tries to argue in court that they must have been delusional. You don't ban a legal defense for killing a fictional animal. You ban it because you think the scenario could actually happen, and you want to make sure the perpetrator cannot escape accountability by claiming madness. The Skamania framework didn't stay isolated. In 1991, Whatcom County in northern Washington passed its own Sasquatch protection resolution, declaring the county a Bigfoot refuge. In 2004, the town of Whitehall in upstate New York, known for a string of Sasquatch encounters by residents and police officers in the 1970s, passed a law making the hunting of Bigfoot illegal and named itself a Bigfoot sanctuary. In 2022, Grays Harbor County in Washington signed its own Bigfoot Protection Proclamation. The legal framework that Skamania County pioneered kept spreading, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, across the country. Each one an independent decision by an independent governing body, arriving at the same conclusion, that something in their forests warranted legal protection. Now here's the part that doesn't make the tourism brochures. This is the story nobody's telling, and it's the reason I wanted to make this video. Washington State leads the nation in Bigfoot sighting reports. Over 700 have been filed with the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization for Washington alone. Skamania County is one of the most concentrated hotspots in the state, and the sightings did not stop when the law was passed. They continued through the 1970s, through the 1980s, through the eruption of Mount St. Helens, through the decades since. They continue now. The BFRO database adds new Washington reports every year, many from the same corridors. The Gifford Pinchot, the Cascade Foothills, the drainages between Mount St. Helens and Mount Adams. The geographic clustering is not random. The Bigfoot sightings follow the same ridgelines, the same old-growth stands, the same river systems, year after year, decade after decade, the same territory the indigenous peoples warned about for centuries. When Mount St. Helens erupted on May 18, 1980, it obliterated the physical landscape where Bigfoot encounters had been concentrated for decades. Ape Canyon was buried. Spirit Lake was destroyed. 230 square miles of forest were flattened in a matter of minutes. 57 people died. The blast zone swallowed the terrain where sightings had been reported consistently since the 1920s. The ridgelines above the Vanderwyte Claim, the drainages near Spirit Lake, the old-growth corridors that connected the mountain's flanks to the deeper Gifford-Pinchot interior. Some researchers have speculated about what the eruption did to any Bigfoot population inhabiting those forests, whether it killed them, displaced them deeper into the backcountry, or scattered a stable population into fragmented groups across the surviving habitat. Nobody knows the answer because nobody investigated, but what we do know is that the sightings didn't stop after 1980. They shifted. They moved deeper into the Gifford-Pinchot, farther from the blast zone, into terrain that became even more difficult to access. After the eruption, reshaped the drainage patterns and destroyed the logging roads that had been the only human access points into the interior. And that shift tells you something important if you're paying attention. If the Bigfoot sightings were hoaxes or misidentifications driven by cultural momentum, you would expect them to continue in the same locations, regardless of what the landscape looked like. Hoaxers go where people go. But the post-eruption reports tracked into territory that was harder to reach, not easier. They followed the surviving old growth, not the blast zone where tourists and volcanologists were flocking by the thousands. The geography of the sightings responded to the geography of the eruption the way an animal population would. By retreating to viable habitat. That is not the pattern of a cultural phenomenon. That is the pattern of a biological one. And then there are the deaths. The two Portland men who died in December 2024 are the most recent and the most widely reported. They went into the Gifford-Pinchot on Christmas Eve, specifically looking for Sasquatch, and never came home. A family member reported them missing at 1 a.m. on Christmas Day. Over 60 search and rescue volunteers from multiple agencies, along with U.S. Coast Guard helicopters running infrared imaging, canine teams, and drones, spent 3 days in freezing rain, snow, and high water levels combing the forest. They found both men dead in a heavily wooded area off Oklahoma Road, near Willard, Washington. The cause of death was exposure, the weather, and what authorities described as ill preparedness. The terrain itself killed them before anything else had the chance to. But here's something the Skamania County Sheriff said in a follow-up statement that I think deserves more attention than it received. Sheriff Summer Shire, who had been employed by the department for 24 years, told Newsweek that she was unaware of any deaths within the county related specifically to searches for Sasquatch prior to that incident. I've read that statement several times now, and I want you to read it carefully too. It does not say nobody has died in those forests. It says she is unaware of deaths specifically attributed to Sasquatch searches. People go missing in the Gifford-Pinchot regularly. People die of exposure, falls, drowning, hypothermia. The forest takes people every year, whether any of those deaths involved encounters with something beyond the terrain and the weather. That is the question the county does not answer, and nobody with the standing to ask it ever has. The institutional silence is the part of this story that I personally find the most unsettling, and it's the thread that ties this whole investigation together. The county protects Bigfoot by law, but does not actively investigate Bigfoot sightings. The Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife has never issued a public statement on Sasquatch. The U.S. Forest Service, which manages the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, the very forest designated as part of the Sasquatch Refuge, does not comment on Bigfoot reports filed by visitors and hikers. There is a law on the books that says this creature is real enough to be endangered and protected, but there is no agency tasked with studying it, monitoring it, or confirming its presence. The legal framework exists. The scientific investigation does not. The law says the creature is there. Every agency with the resources and the jurisdiction to go look stays silent. I've been doing trail stories long enough to know what institutional silence looks like when it shows up in a story, and this is a textbook case, as I've covered in previous videos about how government bodies handle things they cannot explain publicly. The pattern is always the same, acknowledge just enough to manage the situation on the ground, but never enough to invite scrutiny from above. The Skamania County Ordinance is the acknowledgement. The absence of any follow-up investigation is the silence. Think about what you would need to see before you took this seriously. You have a legal framework that assumes Bigfoot exists, endangered species status, a protected refuge encompassing an entire county, criminal penalties for killing one, and a ban on the insanity defense. You have over 700 documented sighting reports in Washington alone. You have indigenous oral traditions spanning centuries and dozens of tribal nations, describing the same type of being in the same geographic corridors. You have physical artifact evidence in Klickitat baskets. You have law enforcement officers photographing tracks. You have a geographic corridor where Bigfoot encounters cluster in patterns that track with surviving old-growth habitat, even after a catastrophic volcanic eruption. And you have zero official investigation by any state or federal wildlife agency. The gap between what the law acknowledges and what the government investigates is the real story here. And it is the story nobody is telling. And I think the deeper question is one that most people skip past because it sounds absurd on the surface. What does it actually mean when a government entity writes a creature that mainstream science says doesn't exist into enforceable law? I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I keep coming back to three possible interpretations. The first is that it's a pure tourism play, cynical, calculated, designed to attract visitors. But that doesn't hold up when you look at the original 1969 context. The county was dealing with armed hunters flooding into the forest and a genuine safety crisis. Tourism was not the priority. The second interpretation is that it's a practical safety measure dressed in Bigfoot clothing, a creative way to restrict firearms in the forest without triggering Second Amendment pushback. That's clever, and there's probably some truth to it, but it doesn't explain why the county named the creature, specifically declared it endangered, and banned the insanity defense. If all you wanted was a firearms restriction, you wouldn't need any of that. The third interpretation is the one that I think is hardest to dismiss. The county commissioners believed the reports. They couldn't say so openly without ridicule. No elected official in America can stand at a podium and say Bigfoot is real without ending their career. But they could put their belief on the record through the one mechanism available to them, the legal code. The ordinance was not a declaration of faith. It was an institutional acknowledgement disguised as local governance, and the insanity defense ban was the tell. You don't preemptively close a legal loophole for a scenario involving a fictional creature. You close it because you think the scenario could happen. That clause alone tells you more about what those commissioners believed than anything they said to the press. What strikes me most is how closely the legal framework mirrors what indigenous communities had been practicing for centuries. The Coast Salish, the Cowlitz, the Klickitat, the Kino, they all followed the same basic approach. Acknowledge the presence. Respect the territory. Leave offerings. Don't go looking for what lives there. Don't interfere. The markers at the edge of Bigfoot territory, the warning poles, the offering sites, the forbidden zones. serves the same function as the Skamania County Ordinance. They told outsiders that something was there, that it was not to be disturbed, and that the consequences of ignoring the warning were real. The county government in 1969 and 1984 arrived at the same conclusion that the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest had held for millennia. They just used a different language to express it. And I think the deeper question here is one that most people skip past because it sounds absurd on the surface, but it is the question that this entire investigation ultimately leads to. What does it actually mean when a government entity writes a creature that mainstream science says doesn't exist into enforceable law? I've spent a lot of time sitting with this, and I keep coming back to three possible interpretations. The first is that it's a pure tourism play. Cynical, calculated, designed to attract visitors and put a tiny rural county on the map. And there's no denying that Skamania County has leaned into the Bigfoot identity. The Chamber of Commerce sells Bigfoot postcards with the ordinance printed on the back. There are statues, there are festivals. There is a photo cutout at the visitor center where you can stick your face into a Bigfoot silhouette and take a picture. Tourism is real, and it matters to a county with 8 people per square mile and limited economic options. But the tourism angle doesn't hold up as a complete explanation when you look at the original 1969 context. The county was dealing with armed hunters flooding into the Gifford Pin Show and a genuine public safety crisis. The ordinance language itself focuses on safety, the threat to persons living or traveling within the county. Tourism was not the priority. Keeping people alive was. The second interpretation is that it's a practical safety measure dressed in Bigfoot clothing, a creative way to restrict firearms in the forest without triggering Second Amendment pushback. That's clever, and there's probably some truth to it. By framing the restriction around Bigfoot rather than around guns, the county avoided a political firestorm that a direct firearms ordinance would have ignited in rural Washington. But this interpretation doesn't explain why the county went so far beyond what was necessary. If all you wanted was a firearms restriction, you wouldn't need to declare the creature an endangered species. You wouldn't need to create a refuge. You wouldn't need to ban the insanity defense at trial. Those provisions serve no safety purpose unless the creature is real. They only make sense if the people writing the law believed in the possibility that someone might actually kill a Bigfoot and stand trial for it. The third interpretation is the one that I think is hardest to dismiss, and it's the one I keep coming back to. The county commissioners believed the reports. They had seen the tracks photographed by their own sheriff. They had read the incident reports filed by their own citizens. They knew the indigenous oral traditions of the region. They had inherited the legacy of Ape Canyon and 6 decades of sightings that never stopped and never produced a satisfactory conventional explanation. They believed something was in those forests, but they couldn't say so openly. No elected official in America can stand at a podium and declare Bigfoot real without ending their career and becoming a national joke. So, they put their belief on the record through the one mechanism available to them that carried legal weight, the county ordinance. The law was not a declaration of faith. It was an institutional acknowledgement disguised as a local governance, and the insanity defense ban was the tell. That single clause, buried in the legal language, tells you more about what those commissioners actually believed than anything they ever said to a reporter. What strikes me most is how closely this Skamania legal framework mirrors what the indigenous communities of this region had been practicing for centuries. The Coast Salish, the Cowlitz, the Klickitat, the Kinaul, they all followed the same basic approach. Acknowledge the presence, respect the territory, leave offerings, don't go looking for what lives there, don't interfere. The markers at the edge of Bigfoot territory, the warning poles, the offering baskets, the forbidden zones, the food left at the forest's edge, serve the same function as the Skamania County Ordinance. They told outsiders that something was there, that it was not to be disturbed, and that the consequences of ignoring the warning were real. The county government in 1969 and 1984 arrived at the same conclusion that the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest had held for millennia. They just used a different language to express it. Where the Coast Salish said Saskatch is a guardian of the forest, the county said Bigfoot is an endangered species in a protected refuge. The message is the same. Stay away. Let it be. I'm not standing here telling you Bigfoot is definitely real. That's not what Trail Stories does. I don't manufacture mystery where the evidence doesn't support it, and I don't pretend to have answers that nobody has. What I'm telling you is that there is a documented, unbroken chain of testimony stretching from indigenous oral traditions predating European contact through the 1924 Ape Canyon siege, through decades of sightings by law enforcement and civilians and Forest Service personnel, through a county government literally writing the creature into the legal code and declaring it endangered. Lying to Horokisen and Ding. And that chain says something is in those forests, something that has been seen consistently in the same places by the same kinds of people for longer than the United States has existed as a country. And the only institutions that refuse to engage with that chain are the ones with the resources to actually investigate it. That tells you something. You can decide for yourself what it tells you, but you can't pretend the chain doesn't exist. The Gifford Pinchot National Forest is still there. Over 1 million acres of old growth, volcanic ridgelines, and unmapped drainages. The law is still on the books. The sighting reports are still being filed. Not from the 1960s, not from the era of grainy film and newspaper sensationalism, but now, today, by people carrying smartphones and GPS devices who still cannot produce definitive proof of what they encountered. The indigenous warnings are still the oldest and most consistent data we have, and people are still going into those forests looking for answers. Some with cameras, some with rifles, some with nothing but curiosity and gear that isn't good enough for the terrain. 2 of them didn't come home last Christmas. I want to leave you with this. The Skamania County Ordinance is often treated as a footnote, a quirky law, a local curiosity, something to smile about and move on. But if you actually read the language, if you trace the history that led to it, if you map the sightings and the indigenous traditions and the institutional behavior that surrounded it, the ordinance stops being funny. It starts being a document that a county government produced because they ran out of other ways to respond to what their people were seeing. They could not investigate it. They didn't have the resources or the scientific infrastructure. They could not deny it. The reports were too numerous and too consistent. They could not explain it. Nothing in the conventional wildlife catalog of Washington State produces 19-inch footprints pressed 4 inches into the ground. So they did the one thing they could do. They wrote it into law. They said on the record, in language that carries the force of criminal prosecution, that this thing exists, that it is endangered, and that this county is its refuge. Skamania County told you exactly what's in those forests. They wrote it into law, put criminal penalties behind it, and declared the entire county a refuge for a creature that mainstream science says doesn't exist. The question isn't whether they believe it. They made their position clear in 1969 and doubled down in 1984. The question is why, after all that, after the law, after the sightings, after the centuries of indigenous testimony, after the deaths, nobody with the authority to actually find the answer has ever been sent to look. That silence is louder than any law, and until someone breaks it, the forests of Skamania County will keep their secrets the way they always have, behind a wall of old growth and volcanic rock, in terrain too rough and too remote for most people to survive, let alone search. Whatever is in there has been there longer than any of us, and it is not waiting to be found. If you found this interesting, consider subscribing for more stories like this.